This audio recording is intended to facilitate the gradual release of confidential documents pertaining to a top-secret exchange program where 12 U.S. military personnel went to the planet Serpo, which was located in the Zeta Reticuli star system between the years 1965 and 1978. This is Release 26A, the Russian version of the violent ET encounter from the KGB. Anonymous comments. Victor, the Russian version differs in many aspects from our American CIA version, but I am not surprised. In all my years in intelligence, the raw intelligence reports are vastly different than the later detailed final Sierra reports. My guess is that the CIA case officers wrote out the report in a very rough draft and then sent it on to HQ, which is the version we gave you. I'm sure the more detailed reports, which I would love to see, has all the particulars contained in the attached translation. Or maybe the CIA case officers who initially reported the first event did not have any further intel data from their CAC of the incident beyond the reported activity at the missile site. This Russian version of the same encounter greatly expands on the series of events that took place after the visitors were remanded into KGB custody. Translation of email received on August 25, 2007 from KGB officer and Major Ivan. Begin. Retired KGB Major Ivan writes, I do recall the incident posted on the American email system by this Victor, but the details are all wrong. The incident happened on the 11th of January 1985. On the early morning hours of 11th January, radar stations in northern Siberia registered two unknown flying objects coming into the Soviet Union. The two radar objects flew at great speeds and registered at 2,000 kilometers per hour. Soviet air defense systems launched 4 interceptor airplanes to identify the radar objects. Strategic Forces Chief of Staff Gorvo was notified. It was difficult to track these radar objects. They were flying so fast or at great speeds, the interceptors could not catch or track the objects. A Soviet general who was in charge of air defense for the northern sector, Siberia, claimed the objects were missiles because of the great speeds they were traveling at in our country. The general alerted all interior defense sectors the Soviet Union had a perimeter of air defense from the exterior frontier to the interior. The interior radar sites could not track the two objects because they were traveling too fast. Border guards and the chief directorate sent control messages updating Gorvo. They would be on the radar screens for just a few seconds compared to a regular flying aircraft that would appear for minutes. The general also said the two objects were flying erratically. The objects were flying from a high altitude to a lower altitude within just a few seconds. No normal airplane could fly like that. This worried many Soviet command staff personnel. Soviet radar lost track of the two objects in the central part of the country. A brief radar contact was observed north of Bratsk. Sometime around noon on the 11th of January, Soviet internal police reported residents of Zhumarova reported a strange object in a collective farm field. Police arrived in Zhumarova from Cheremkrova and Kuyata. 2 police officers drove to the object. They observed a second object flying directly above the ground object. The police officers tried to radio their command center in Cheremkrova, but their radio did not work. The police officers did not see any occupants from the object. The police officers drove away and their radio was functional. About 15 minutes later, the object flew away from Zhumarova. The police officers notified the Soviet military base in Cheremkrova and warned them of the two objects flying east. A military helicopter flew from Cheremkrova west towards Zhumarova. The two pilots later reported seeing the two flying unknown, unidentified objects east at a higher altitude and at a great speed. The objects flew directly towards the missile site. Soviet Military Command Central notified the missile base and warned them of the intruding flying objects. GUCOS ICBM Chief Directorate Chief was sent an urgent controlled message. The missile base went on high alert, priority alert in Russian. Military guards watched the two objects approach the missile base. One of the objects flew very low over the base. Military guards fired anti-aircraft guns at the approaching object. The bullets' shells struck the enemy object but was absorbed or passed directly through the object. The craft glowed a bluish-green color and then landed. Military guards surrounded the object. Personnel from the 2nd Chief Directorate in conjunction with GRU-MRVD responded. The object opened a door and a bright light appeared in the doorway. 5 occupants walked out of this light and onto the ground. Military guards ordered the occupants to lie down. The order was given in Russian. The 5 occupants did nothing and stood together. One of the military commanders gave instructions in English, but the occupants still did nothing. One of the occupants walked towards the military guards. One military guard fired a rifle and hit the occupant in the chest. The occupant fell to the ground. The other 4 occupants walked to the fallen occupant and just sat on the ground. Military guards surrounded the 5 occupants and pushed them with their rifles in a gesture towards a military vehicle. The 4 occupants carried their fallen comrade to the military vehicle. The occupants were driven to a confinement facility in Cheremkova. Briefly, they were transferred to a bigger vehicle and taken to a military compound in Irkutsk. The military intelligence interrogation building within the Irkutsk military compound central was used. Military officials attempted to interrogate the 4 occupants. Many different languages were used, English, Spanish, German, but the occupants never acknowledged any language. The injured occupant received first aid by a Soviet military doctor. The doctor told the commander in charge that the injured occupant was not human. The injured occupant's blood was thick white fluid. The internal organs of the occupant was different than humans. The occupant were radiographed X-rayed. The occupants were described as being approximately 1.2 meters in height and weighed approximately 100 kilograms. The occupants had no ears, no thumbs, small horizontal openings for mouths, and no hair. The occupants were wearing identical one-piece flying suits, gray in color. Suddenly, eventually, the injured occupant stood up and walked to the other occupants. The injured occupant seemed healed. The occupants had no weapons or other equipment on their person bodies. GRU officials arrived and took over the interrogation. One KGB official was on the scene with the GRU. Commander GRU-CMRD received a controlled urgent message updating the status of the occupants and craft. Military officials examined the occupants' craft. It appeared the craft was not made from any technology known to the military officials examining the craft. The interior of the craft was very small. Only small Soviet military officials could enter. No instrument panels or navigational controls were observed. There was one display panel which appeared to be similar to a television screen. Small hand indentations were located on the display panel. The occupants were transferred from Irkutsk by a Soviet military plane to Moscow. The occupants' craft was loaded onto a large truck and driven to Irkutsk. The occupants arrived in a location south of Moscow and detained inside a confinement center. They were given water and food, Russian black bread and soup. The occupants did not eat or drink. Several interrogation sessions occurred with the occupants by KGB and Soviet military linguists from the 2nd Chief Directorate and the KGB language school were present, but the occupants never spoke nor communicated. On the 14th of January, 1985, in the early morning hours, the 5 occupants escaped from their confinement room cells. A large search was initiated, but the 5 occupants were not found. The captured craft was stored in a hangar at a military base. On the 14th of January, 1985, the craft flew out of the hangar, destroying the hangar door with a bluish beam of light. This was the end of the incident. The incident became very secretive within the KGB GRU. Many senior officials within the Kremlin were worried, but it seemed that the Kremlin knew something about these crafts. Senior officials were not surprised, but only concerned about the successful penetration into the country. GUCOS and GURVO updated reporting procedures and debriefed personnel. I have not thought about this incident in many, many years. I wish I could go to the Kremlin today and look up the documents, but I am retired and I cannot have access. Please make your American friends know the truth. The CIA was wrong. Their spies lied. But what worries me is that the CIA had spies within our Soviet military that we never caught. End KGB Major Ivan's report. Moderator's closing note. Our CIA would have no reason to lie about the number of alien craft nor the number of alien beings during this incident. Due to the number of translation problems we encountered, lie in this case may be more like a discrepancy. Moderator's endnotes. Here are some highly relevant passages from 4 classic UFO books that everyone should be familiar with. For those few of you, I hope, who have not read Phil Corso's landmark 1997 book, The Day After Roswell, I strongly recommend that you do so at your earliest convenience, as it'll provide a wealth of background information and what in education is called prior knowledge as a concept. Here are some choice, relevant excerpts from Corso's book. The use of a headband in the alien navigation system. Then there was the strangest device of all, a headband, almost with electrical signal pickup devices on either side. These eyewitness reports suggested to me that the sensors stimulated different parts of the brain while at the same time exchanged information with the brain. Again, using the analogy of an EEG, these devices were a very sophisticated mechanism for translating the electrical impulses inside the creature's brains into specific commands. Perhaps these headband devices comprised the pilot interface of the ship's navigational and propulsion system. At first, I didn't know, but it was only when we began development of the long brainwave research project toward the end of my tenure at Pentagon that I realized just what we had and how it might be developed. It took a long time to harvest this technology, but 50 years after Roswell, versions of these devices eventually became a component of the navigational control systems for some of the Army's most sophisticated helicopters and will soon be on the American consumer electronic market. As user input devices for personal computer games, they are today 60 years later. The first Army Air Force analysts and engineers, both at the 509th and at Wright Field, were also bedeviled by the lack of any traditional controls and propulsion systems in the crashed vehicle. Looking at their reports and at the artifacts from the perspective of 1961, however, I imagine that the keys to understanding what made the craft go and directed its flights lay not only with the craft itself, but in the relationship between the pilot and the craft. If we hypothesized a brainwave guidance system that was as specific to the pilot's electronic signature as it was to the spacecraft's, then we were looking at an entirely revolutionary concept of guided flight in which the pilot was the system. Imagine transportation devices in which the key to the ignition is a digitized code derived from your electroencephalographic signature and is read automatically upon your donning some sort of sensorized headband. The engineers who first discovered this were amazed at the pure conductivity of these skins, functionally like the skin of the craft itself, and their obvious ability to protect the wearer while at the same time vectoring some kind of electronic field. Where was the physical junction of the circuit between the pilot and the ship? Was it turned on and off somewhere by the pilot himself through a switch we didn't know about? Alongside the riddle of the apparent absence of navigational controls, I listed the sensorized headband that so intrigued the officers at Roswell's Walker Field and fascinated me as well. If, as we all suspected, this device picked up the electronic signatures from the creature's oversized brain, what did it do with them? I believe that these headbands translated the brain's electronic signals into system commands that controlled speed, direction, and elevation. Maybe the headbands had to be calibrated or tuned to each individual pilot, or maybe the pilot had to be calibrated to the headband. Either way, the headbands were the interface between the pilot and the ship, but that still didn't resolve the question of the lack of cables, gears, or wires. Maybe the answer lay not in the lack of structural controls, but in the way the suit, the headband, the creature's brains, and the entire craft worked together. In other words, when I looked at the possible function of the entire system, the synchronicity between the brain interface in the headband, the pure conductivity of the spacecraft, and the elongated structure of the space skins, which also acted like a circuit, I could see how directional instructions could have been translated by the headband into some form of current flowing through the skins and into this series of raised deck panels where there were indentations for the creature's hands. The indentations on these panels, as the Roswell field reports described them, looked like the handprints pressed into the concrete at the old Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. Note, KGB Major wrote small hand indentations were located on the display panels. Were the directional commands a series of electronic instructions transmitted directly from the creature's brains along their bodies and through the panels into the ship itself, as if the ship were only an extension of the creature's body? For that to have been the case, something was still missing: the engine. What if the craft itself were the engine, imparted with a steady current from another source that it stored as if it were a giant capacitor? I suspected the Roswell craft was simply a capacitor that stored current that was controlled or vectored by the pilot and was able to be recharged in some way, or could recharge itself with some form of built-in generator. That's the way I believe the spacecraft was navigated, by direct interaction between the electronic waves generated within the minds of the pilot and the craft's directional controls. The electronic brain signals were interpreted and transmitted by the headband devices, which served as interfaces and perhaps used the small hand indentations described by the KGB Major on the ship's panel to interface with the ship. If the Soviets had gotten their hands on some of the apparatus from any one of the alien spacecraft that had gone down since 1947, and I didn't know how many there were, they'd have figured out by now that the aliens had used some form of brainwave control for navigation. How they directed their thoughts or translated them into electronic circuits, we didn't know. But we knew that there were no steering wheels or conventional methods of control on the spacecraft, and the headbands we found with the electronic sensors on them were designed to pick up some form of signal from the brain. The analyst at Wright Field believed that the sensors on the headbands corresponded with points on the multilobed alien brain that generated low-frequency waves, so their headbands formed an integral part of the circuit. The alien propulsion system. There were no conventional technological explanations for the way the Roswell craft's propulsion system operated. There were no atomic engines, no rockets, no jets, nor any propeller-driven form of thrust. The craft was able to displace gravity through the propagation of magnetic wave controlled by shifting the magnetic poles around the craft so as to control or vector not a propulsion system, but a repulsion force of like charges. Once they realized this, engineers at our country's primary defense contractors raced among themselves to figure out how the craft could retain its electric capacity and how the pilots who navigated it could live within the energy field of a wave. The initial revelations into the nature of the spacecraft and its pilot's interface came very quickly during the first few years of testing at Norton Air Force Base. The Air Force discovered that the entire vehicle functioned just like a giant capacitor. In other words, the craft itself stored the energy necessary to propagate the magnetic wave that elevated it, allowed it to achieve escape velocity from the Earth's gravity, and enabled it to achieve speeds of over 7,000 miles per hour. The pilots weren't affected by the tremendous G-force that builds up in the acceleration of conventional aircraft because to aliens inside, it was as if gravity was being folded around the outside of the wave that enveloped the craft. Maybe it was like traveling inside the eye of a hurricane. But how did the pilots interface with the waveform they were generating? The secret to this system could be found in the single-piece skin-tight coverall spun around the creatures. The lengthwise atomic alignment of the strange fabric was a clue that somehow the pilots became part of the electrical storage and generation of the craft itself. They didn't just pilot or navigate the vehicle, they became part of the electrical circuitry of the vehicle, vectoring it in a way similar to the way you order a voluntary muscle to move. The vehicle was simply an extension of their own bodies because it was tied into their neurological systems in ways that even today we are just beginning to utilize. So the creatures were able to survive extended periods living inside a high-energy wave by becoming the primary circuit in the control of the wave. They were protected by their suits, which enclosed them head to feet, but their suits enabled them to become one with the vehicle, literally part of the wave. In 1947, this was a technology so new to us that it was frightening as it was frustrating. If we could only develop the power source necessary to generate a consistently well-defined magnetic wave around a vehicle, we could harness a technology by which we could surpass all forms of rocket and jet propulsion. It's a process we're still trying to master today, 50 years, 60 years now, after the craft fell into our possession. And from Timothy Good's book, Alien Liaison, in response to a question on UFOs from a group of workers in the Urals in early 1990, President Mikhail Gorbachev stated that the phenomenon of UFOs does exist and it must be treated seriously. Times have certainly changed, but the Committee for State Security, KGB, still maintains firm control over the dissemination of information on the subject, principally through its third chief directorate, which deals with military counterintelligence. See Project Serpo, posting number 26, section The KGB of the Soviet Union. During a screening of the film E.T. at the White House in the summer of 1982, President Reagan is reported to have whispered to producer Steven Spielberg, "There are probably only 6 people in this room who know how true this is." In addition, Reagan has stated on at least 3 occasions that a threat from outer space would have a unifying effect on world's nations, and he has raised the matter with both President Gorbachev and Edward Shevardnadze, the former Soviet foreign minister. Some years ago, Bill Moore, UFO researcher author, learned of the existence of a special interest group within the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, which comprised 2 distinct branches feeding data to Project Aquarius, which was supervised by the DIA's Directorate for Management and Operations. One was lodged at the DIA's Imagery Division, DC-5C, and operated from the Melpar Building in Falls Church, Virginia, with an additional presence at the Digital Imagery Processing Services, DIPS, in the Naval Intelligence Support Center, NISC, Suitland, Maryland. The group oversaw a small black budget appropriation, and need-to-know access was maintained by probably not more than a dozen individuals at any given time, Bill reports. Over a space of several years, I only ever heard 3 names of people reportedly associated with it. I have been led to understand since then that the group, now referred to as a working committee, underwent something of a reorganization in the latter part of 1986, and as far as I know, it continues to function. One of the results of that reorganization was the establishment of a computerized database and communications net known, curiously enough, as MJ SETI. Moderator's note: this group from the Defense Intelligence Agency continues its work today under Anonymous, and the DIA-6 comprised of former and current active members of the DIA with full access to the Briefing Control Access roster. I have been asked not disclose its official name as it is actually known in government circles. Another visit was to a bunker-like building north of Houston where Bob Olster learned how to operate a peculiar panel that he believes must have come from an alien craft. It had a series of vertical cylinders made of multicolored lights that terminated in a hood about 4 feet above the panel. When one inserts a hand to break the beam and then raises or lowers a hand, a comparable action takes place within what appears to be some kind of clear-looking cylinder that resides in the base of the console corresponding to each beam. It was some kind of control panel. That was all I learned. I think it was being considered for use in the UFO exhibit area of Cosmic Journey. Note: the small hand indentations on the display panels in the KGB Major's report. And now, from another Timothy Good book, Alien Base, Inside the Spacecraft. The following evening, Howard Menger was taken on board one of the spacecraft for the first time, a short hop from one of the landing sites to another. Just before entering the craft, one of the spacemen pointed an instrument at Menger, and a bluish beam of light struck his head, producing a rather pleasant tingling sensation. We projected the beam on you to condition and process your body quickly so you could enter the craft, Menger was told. What actually happened was that the beam changed your body's frequency to equal that of the craft. Thus, you felt entirely comfortable inside the craft and suffered no ill effects. Howard Menger writes, "We stepped into a large circular room. In the center of it was an ample-sized round table made of translucent material. Under the tabletop, pulsating lights of many colors moved. The dowel-shaped stem supporting the table was set in what appeared to be a huge magnifying glass, itself set into the floor. Approximately 1/3 of the circular room was devoted to instrument panels containing many colored lights blinking on and off. In front of the control room was a frame containing what I guess was some kind of viewing screen." The voice. "The hull has a field about it which repels all other matter, shells, bullets fired at it. Your physicist would describe the force involved as the antiparticle of the binding energy of the atom. When certain elements such as platinum are properly prepared and treated with a saturation exposure to a beam of a very high energy photon, the anti-banding energy particles will be generated outside of the nucleus. Since these particles tend to repel each other as well as all other matter, they, like the electron, tend to migrate to the surface of the metal where they manifest as a repellent force. Perhaps you noticed that the hull seemed unusually smooth and slippery. That is because your flesh did not actually come into contact with the metal, but was held a short distance from it by the repulsion of the field. We use the field to protect the hull from being scratched or damaged or attacked during landings. It also lowers air friction greatly where it becomes necessary to travel at high speeds through any atmosphere. The field produces an almost perfect laminar flow of air or any gas about the craft, and little heat is generated or transmitted to the hull." And lastly, from yet another of Timothy Good's fine books, Beyond Top Secret. Inside the craft. Each of the rooms that was occupied had instrument panels on the walls with the alien crew members concentrating on the instruments. Some rooms had 4 or 5 instruments, others had 15 or 20, but they were all of a similar type in each room. They were nothing like ours. There were no screens such as our oscilloscopes. They had meters, but I could not see dials on them. He said they lit up only when in use. Sid Patrick was shown an oblong lens which he took to be part of a viewing system with a magnified 3-dimensional effect. He, the alien, told me that the power source of the craft he was in was transferred to them from the other craft and that it did all of the navigation and manipulation through space. He told me they don't measure time and distance as we know it, but rather in terms of light. When I asked him how fast they traveled through space, he answered that their speed was limited only by the speed at which they could transfer their energy source. The Aztec case. According to Otto Kraus, there were no survivors from the craft which crashed near Aztec. All the bodies inside were dead, Alfred told me. The one at Aztec is the one they gained the technology from. Further information on what seems almost certainly to have been the Aztec crash has been provided by a former military officer to the reliable researcher Chuck Oldham. While stationed at a certain base, the officer's special security clearance enabled him to gain access to a restricted library where he studied a file describing the retrieval of an alien craft and its dead occupants. The aliens found inside were described as beings like us, but smaller. 2 of the bodies were badly charged, though the clothing, one-piece flight suits woven with a type of fabric with a tensile strength of 800 pounds per inch squared, was unaffected. No reference to the craft's propulsion system was made in the report other than that technology utilizing magnetic or gravitational fields was involved. They used the natural magnetic lines of a planet and a gravity field to move their ships from one place to another, the officer explained to Chuck Oldham. That's how they are able to make their near right-angle turns. It was speculated that the aliens were able to cross greater distances of space within a much shorter time than we thought possible. The report further speculated that this craft and others had come to grief due to magnetic faults located in the areas where the crashes had occurred. Where do they come from and why are they here? I believe that man's progress on planet Earth has been monitored by beings whose technological and mental resources make ours look primitive and theirs supernatural by comparison. The fact that some of the visitors are similar to us physiologically suggests that we share a genetic link. Could it be that some of them have had a hand in our evolution? Now that our technology has reached the stage where we are endangering the planet and expanding our exploration of space, UFO surveillance has intensified. Is it mere coincidence that the modern wave of sightings began during the Second World War as we began developing nuclear weapons and rockets? Or is it coincidental that UFOs have exhibited so much interest in our nuclear missile sites and have demonstrated their ability to paralyze launching systems? Until we wake up to the fact that information of quite unprecedented and profound significance is being withheld from us, we shall continue to remain in ignorance. Sources: the day after Roswell, a former Pentagon official reveals the U.S. government's shocking UFO cover-up, by Colonel Philip J. Corso. Alien Liaison: The Ultimate Secret, by Timothy Good. Alien Base: Earth's Encounter with Extraterrestrials, by Timothy Good. Beyond Top Secret: The Worldwide UFO Security Threat, by Timothy Good. And that is the end of this video. If you like things like this, please give this video a thumbs up. Please share this video. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I'll have more things like this. Take care.